Great. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today on the webinar with Daniel. A little background about us before we start. SustainED Group is a nonprofit organization with a vision to empower the next generation of sustainability leaders to take action and scale impact with the support by a community of mentors. To solve the tough problems we're facing now, we know the world needs exponentially more change makers, and we need leaders like yourself to step up and lead the initiatives, and we need you to learn faster from the current practitioners and be even more effective. That's why we're hosting a webinar series as part of our initiatives to build a community of change makers. So joining us today is Daniel. He's working on climate resilience with the Intact Center at the University of Waterloo, and he will share with us the key insights from his career journey and in the field of climate resilience and infrastructure. So without further ado, I'll introduce you to Jenn, who's a 17-year-old high school student that's very passionate about climate change and sustainability issues. I'm passing over to you, Jenn and Daniel.
Just to start, I'm just going to do a quick rapid fire so we can get to know you a little bit better. So, do you consider yourself more of a morning or night person?
Personally, definitely a night person.
Yeah. What would you say is your favorite snack?
Favorite snack? Definitely pizza.
Sunrise or sunset?
Well, given I'm a night person, I can mostly get a sunset in. Sunrise is tough.
What is your favorite summer activity? Like, let's say COVID wasn't happening, what would you want to do?
Love to swim. So if I could go to a friend's cottage, I'd love to do that. Love to go swim.
Are you a dog or a cat person?
We talked about this earlier. Definitely a dog person. We just got a rescue dog from Mexico 8 months ago now, and her name is Willow. So she's a sweetheart, and she's my kind of temperament dog. Very mellow, likes to hang out all day, and then likes to swim as well. So it's a nice little new addition to the
I've been hearing about a lot of people getting quarantine puppies because like they have time to foster one since everyone's home.
Absolutely.
So it's really great to see them getting out of shelters and like that. Okay. Could you, in just 20 seconds, no jargon, what do you do for work?
Yeah, so I'm a program manager at the Intact Center on Climate Adaptation. So what I do is I do a lot of work with developing new either standards, sitting on boards, doing presentations, and also writing reports on what is the new research climate change, but then also how is that not only affecting people physically with the dangers associated with natural disasters, but also how is it affecting the economy? So really trying to bring in people maybe who aren't historically a part of the conversation, like banks, insurance groups, real estate agents, and letting them know they're actually all a part of this larger umbrella under sustainability and climate adaptation. Trying to not just preach to the converted, like we do a lot of the times when we're environmentalists, we're talking to people who already understand climate change and why it's such a big issue. I talk to groups who maybe historically haven't thought about it, and telling them there's actually money to be made and there's money to be saved by investing in climate adaptation and preparing for the next 50, 100 years out.
Why is it important for you to do what you do?
I think it's important for me to do what I do because sustainability, I think historically has always been this maybe thought of from people who think they're on the outside looking in as just kind of this very elite club. You have to take an environmental science, you have to have an engineering degree, you have to have a planning degree, you have to have a chemistry degree, biology degree, elite club that's trying to protect the world. And people who don't understand it then at that point generally either look at it and go, oh, that's something I can't care about, I've got a million other things to worry about, or they think they can't get into the club and they can't understand how they would be a part of it. So why my job, I look at it as important, is it says sustainability is this large umbrella that and it's trying to talk to groups to say, you're a part of this and we want to help you get to that point, either through training programs or through presentations saying, it's really important to have you on our team, and we're all kind of fighting for the sustainability of the planet, and everyone can have a piece in there, whether it's if you're taking women's studies, whether if you're taking solely economic studies, whether if you're focused, on the smallest little thing in chemistry or physics that seems like it has nothing to do with the environment, every kind of field falls under that umbrella. And that's why I think my work can be important.
Okay, so I think we're going to start on you telling us a little bit more about what you're working on now.
Most of my work deals with how climate change is actually exacerbating the effects of flooding, mainly in Canada. I also do a lot of work internationally, working with some other groups, the Netherlands, the Flood Ed program that is based out of Great Britain. All these other things come together, and what my work kind of entails is looking at projects, looking at on-the-ground work that can be done, but also at a higher level, what are some of these standards that have been put out? What are some of these new research pieces that have been put out? And yeah, really, so my work is trying to look at a high level, what is everyone doing and how we can bring that down to a grassroots community level that everyone can get involved with, kind of what I talked about before. Everyone can be involved in sustainability, and really the work I'm focusing on now is that's really come out within the past 5 years or so. And really, I'll delve into it a little more through the presentation, but what's the difference between when we talk about a sustainable future, climate change, and mitigation versus what's climate adaptation and what is resilient kind of initiatives and projects we can kind of work on. So that's kind of what I'll touch on a bit. So I'll discuss today, just throughout the presentation, just very short, climate adaptation is, what's our background, how did we get started, flooding on the rise, why is that happening nowadays, why is it increasing, and kind of what we can do about it. And then I'll touch on current projects in the past 2 years. And then I'll actually touch on, and this was a great piece that Jennifer and Wen, you both brought up to me, past this point, and what is all the different levels of work I've done before. So the Intact Center on Climate Adaptation, that's the office I work in. Obviously with COVID, this is my home office now that I've been working on it for the past 3 months. I'm hoping to get back in there soon, but it's a really nice office. It's a bullfrog powered. It's trying to get to a point where the campus is carbon neutral for the next few years. It has all the solar panels on the top. It's got the kind of great window openings at the top. So it's got this beautiful atrium. It's got a green living wall that goes up 4 stories all the way to the top where I work on the 4th story. It's just a really nice building that they put on the University of Waterloo campus within the past, I believe, 6 years. So that's where I work out of. For anyone who's not in the area of Ontario, the University of Waterloo, it's based out of, as the name suggests, Waterloo, Ontario. It's about an hour and a half from Toronto. And so we're an applied climate adaptation research center, and we started and were launched in 2015 with a gift, essentially financial funding from Intact Financial Corporation. And Intact Financial Corporation is the largest property insurer and home insurer in Canada. And the reason they actually invested in us is our head, Dr. Blair Feltmate, was doing a lot of work. His background's actually, he's a vet, and he studied macro invertebrates, benthic invertebrates, which are just tiny water bugs, and seeing, looking at the different species assemblages or diversity, you were able to tell how healthy a general river system was. He moved from that, and then he went into actually corporate sustainability and really helped coin that term in Canada, and was trying to bring banks, insurance, and all these groups on board saying, hey, you can be part of the sustainable solution. And actually, if you invest in this now, you're going to be saving money in the future by avoiding a fire that could impact your regular day-to-day business and your supply chain, all that stuff. But also, you can help be some of the people who are on the front lines of leading this charge of how Canadians can adapt to climate change. So that's how we started back in 2015. And then just this year in 2020, we got funding from the University of Waterloo and Intact Financial to go for another 5 years of research, which is really exciting. So we just got that confirmed back in April. Our 2 main goals at the center, we want to change the national conversation about climate change to address climate adaptation. So like I talked about before, it's really great to talk about climate mitigation, what we can do to sequester carbon, what we can do to footprint, how we can have energy efficiency transportation with public transportation like electric buses. A group called Qtric here in Canada does a great job, CUTRIC. They do a great job looking at how they want to electrify fleets. To do here in Guelph, they've been doing it in Brampton, they've been doing it in Montreal, across the country. But really taking the discussion, when especially we've been talking about carbon taxes, or we've been talking about green bonds, if you know anything about that, it's great to look at making the polluters pay it and then investing in how we can limit air pollution. There's also a lot of stuff we have to do now. Today, climate change is already impacting us. And I'll get to a graph just shortly to show that. But over the past, we've been hit time and time again with devastating floods. Here in Canada, Fort McMurray in northern Alberta just got hit with a devastating flood that wiped out a large portion of the town. And the costs already are seemingly $230 million. And now granted, that's the initial cost, and that's a one-time event. They have wildfires there. They had a major wildfire in 2016. And the end result of that with flooding was $6 billion. So there's lots of money where a lot of these people too, they might not have home insurance. They might not have flood insurance. They might not have fire insurance. So once your home gets burnt down or flooded out, you might be left with paying a mortgage on essentially a house that's been kind of dilapidated and you have nowhere to go. So we really want to help Canadians make sure they can do some work to be invested in this, and you can adapt to be resilient to climate change, which is happening now, and mitigate in the future. The best way I kind of look at it is climate adaptation or resiliency is like your biweekly paycheck coming in every 2 weeks, and climate mitigation. So you want to be using that money that you get in each week to pay for food, pay for housing, pay for some small little events you want to go out to. But you always want to put a little bit of that money into your retirement savings to be set into the future 30, 40, or 50 years. So that's kind of how those two play to each other. And then our second kind of major goal is we want to help homeowners, communities, businesses, and governments associated with climate change and extreme weather events.
So that's actually a great, sorry to interrupt, but that was a great analogy. That was a great analogy that you pulled, just kind of like on the, the now money and the later money, because I was reading before how, especially for people on the coastal areas of their countries, and even, sometimes in the middle, but the flooding costs can cost up to much as 10 times as much in about 10 years. Scary to think, like, just in these 10 years that we have left to kind of really tackle and make an impact in climate change, like we all need to be working together. So I think you're about to touch upon it. You're seeing kind of like in your sector, like, are more people hopping on this train, or do you have to deal with more pushback than you anticipated?
Surprisingly, and it depends, like I said before, because everyone's under this umbrella of sustainability. When you tell people, and even the average Canadian, that climate change is impacting their bottom dollar, a lot of people usually perk up and pay attention. And that's what I found. It's great to talk about. In my history, and I'll get to that a little bit later, I focused a lot on the impacts of the biophysical world. What's the impacts on frog populations or fish populations when we're doing major construction projects, when we're putting more pollutants in the water. And that's important to a good number of people, but it's not important to everybody. And it's making sure they can take care of themselves and their families. And that's where money comes into play. So this chart I have up here, and again, my apologies, it's a little busy, but what it's trying to show is from 1983 up till 2009, the average cost of associated extreme weather events averaged around $430 million per year. We had a big spike. If some of you remembered when you were younger, the Eastern ice storm knocked out a large portion of the eastern part of Canada. Ontario wind and rain impacts, flooding and high winds, and Quebec floods in the mid-90s and then mid-2000s. That really jumped those numbers up. But as we get over to 2009 and forward up until today, that average cost saving 2015 in this case, as we can see here, the smaller bar, the average cost of insurable losses was $1.8 billion per year. And now these are insured losses. And we have to remember, not everything is insured. A lot of Canadians are deemed in high-risk zones. About 10% of Canadians, or 1.8 million people in Canada, are deemed in or 1.8 million homes in Canada are deemed in high-risk zones, especially to flooding. And so within that, you've got to remember, these people, when they reach out to their insurance, their insurance group will say, we can't afford to insure you because we know you're going to get flooded out every spring, and we can't keep paying those out if you're going to issue a claim. So what this is showing losses. So this is what insurance companies will pay out. But these numbers, as high as they are, these figures are 3 to 4 times higher for uninsurable losses for average Canadians and for governments. A group out of who are called the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, they collaborated on a major project with the Insurance Bureau of Canada. They released that all government levels, federal, provincial, and municipal, would have to spend $5.3 billion per year just to safely protect Canadian communities around the country, to protect them from climate change impacts like this. And what this is showing is there's an increase in numbers of homes that are uninsurable or they have a low cap limit, meaning that, you know, the average basement flood cost, both insured and uninsurable, is $43,000 a year. That's a lot of money. And I know it sounds like a lot, but personally, Toronto, she's had chronic flooding happen every year. That cost us $20,000 just to fix and flood-proof her basement. And the reason it was so cheap, because myself and my father were able to help and do a bit of the labor. But this is a costly thing that a lot of the actions and education needs to come out that Canadians need to do. So when I'm a roundabout answer to your question, Jennifer, is, are people jumping on this? Absolutely. But again, the education's still only getting out there. When we're talking about resiliency and climate adaptation, again, I've only seen as really a buzzword within the past 5 years. So people are this train, and it's picking up steam, and more people have to get on board to understand what's occurring.
That's a great answer. Yeah.
Moving forward to what some, I guess whether you want to say flatten that curve there, if we're going to draw parallel to COVID. When I came on, before I was working at a college here in Toronto called Seneca, and I was doing a lot of work with my 2 other colleagues there, Andrew Hong and Andrew Wickham, and we were part of the Eco Seneca Initiatives project group there, really running resiliency at the college level and how college programs can embed themselves in that, which they've still been doing with their environmental project management courses for graduates. So it's really great to see the work they've done there. And I was able to help out with a little bit and then co-opted to this job. I was working at Seneca College before. I started collaborating with the Intact Center before I started working with them. And I was able to develop a college level course for home inspectors, developers, and insurance brokers. So it's a 14-week course, and it's called the Home Flood Risk Assessment Training Course. It's offered online across Canada online right now. And what it does is it takes that you're able to go through a home, it's an 80-point inspection, and say, this is where you're at risk for flooding inside the home, and this is where you're at flooding risk outside the home. It highlights this, creates a tailored report, you print it out, give it to the homeowner, and they can see, this is where I need to be investing my money. Because a lot of people can't afford a lot of flood-proof your home. Even the simplest stuff, it takes time and it takes effort to put it into. It's cheap for the initial work, but if you're in a high-risk home, it gets steadily more expensive as you go through the years. Another project I just finished up with, I have a webinar picture of myself. That's our head, Dr. Blair Feltmate, with the Intact Center logo behind him, University of Waterloo. Our director, Cheryl Evans, who will also be doing a talk here, I think, later on in July. And then that's the warden of Antigonish County. His name's Owen McCron, out on the East Coast. So we partnered with St. Francis Xavier University out in the East Coast in Nova Scotia, the town of Antigonish, the county of Antigonish, and then Buttonkeck First Nation. And we worked with all these groups to say, what can we do right now, and how can we educate all your different various groups who have different understandings about this, different ways of going how to protect themselves. How can we help you guys out, educate your constituents, and help protect them? So that's some of the really cool projects I get to work on. I get to collaborate with a lot of groups. Some of my other projects, I got to work with the Canadian Red Cross, travel to Squamish, BC. They get hit with flooding from estuaries, ocean estuaries. They get glacial flooding because they're right there in the mountains. And then they have a major river system which runs down. So they get hit 3 different ways. And it was really working with them, seeing how their new diking projects working, how's that protecting people, and then what homeowners can do by themselves at the lot level. So those are some of the projects I currently work on at my job.
That's awesome. I just wanted to prompt just our second poll on just kind of like flood risk in our audience's like own life. So I think our back end will pop it up, but the question is, do you consider flood risk in your life? Like, what do you guys, like, is it more you're proactive, or maybe you're becoming more aware, or it's not really an issue for you? Okay. Oh, very interesting. Okay. Yeah, so we have a lot of people saying that they're more pretty cool. And I think I'm probably in the maybe category of I'm becoming more aware. And Daniel's obviously in the he knows the most. So yeah. Okay.
And that's something to look at where you shouldn't feel bad if you're going, I haven't considered it before, because part of my job is going out there in communities and educating more people about it. You can't expect people to understand to drive a car until you've educated them, they've gone through driver's ed, and then you've actually shown them how to use the accelerator, how to turn, how to use signals. All this stuff is, we have to help educate people, and we can't just say, oh, they're ignorant, they don't know about climate change. They have to be told what is out there and what could potentially impact them. A great kind of piece I always bring up is when I was teaching this course, I had one of the students who was a fairly staunch believer that climate change wasn't real. When I was talking about it was, well, this is great. What are we going to do? Just sit in a circle and sing Kumbaya and roast marshmallows? We're not going to change the world. And I said, that's fine. That's your opinion. And I said, would you agree though, across this country, our infrastructure is out of date? He said, yes. So I said, so like our sewage systems, they're prepared for a 1 in 5 year storm, for example, in Toronto. We keep hearing about these 1 in 100 year storms that keep happening in a lot less time than 1 in 100 years. They happen seemingly, it seems like every 5 years. Would you not say that we have to update a lot of our infrastructure? Yes. Would you say we're getting rid of a lot of our green infrastructure, our wetlands, our open park spaces? And he said, yes. I said, okay, well, those act as a natural sponge. It has nothing to do with climate change and mitigating climate change. But it has to do, like, we have to, as communities, as cities, as urban planners, as storytellers, we all have to get on this train and say, we have to do more work. And it doesn't have to be solely about climate change. It's also our inability to fully adapt and prepare for these more potential storms. Whether you think it's climate change solely, or whether you think it's just because we haven't been upgrading our systems. Either way is fine. You're going to get to the same end result. You're fixing something in the system to make sure more people are safe and either not losing their lives, or they're not losing their life savings for their greatest investment, which is generally their home. So this is some of the other work I work on. We've created reports over the 5 years since the Intech Center started. We created a home flood protection guideline, water on the rise, what homeowners can do at home. New community flood protection guideline. This is what communities around country, this is how developers should be designing new Canadian communities to protect the residents from potential flooding happenstances. Existing community flood protection guideline. I'm currently sitting on the technical committee and board of the Canadian Standards Association right now, talking about how we can make this a new guideline and standard across the country, where 65% of our building stock in Canada are these existing communities where people are living in homes and they need to be protected, and they're not adequately protected. So that's some of the work I do there. And then commercial real estate. If you guys remember, especially if you're in the GTA region, several years ago, 2 men got trapped in an elevator when it was flooding in 2013. And the elevator actually dipped into the parking garage where it was completely flooded, and they got trapped there underwater. And police and firefighters had to go in, open it with a crowbar, and luckily those men survived. But part of this, what we put in that standard is to say all these elevators in major buildings, in commercial buildings, should have flood sensors at the bottom. So the minute they sense any water in that elevator shaft, they'll return to the next floor that has no water on them. So we're not putting people's lives at risk. And then the two ones I'm really passionate about, and I think is a great piece that we've been talking about, it maybe has been pushed aside a little bit, is what is the value of natural infrastructure? And there's a cost to it. So when we're saying avoidance costs, I'm saying if you're going to take out a natural infrastructure piece or green infrastructure piece like a large wetland to build a new mall, hey, that's great. But if you take that out, the cost is going to be hundreds of millions of dollars in terms of how it's going to damage, because you don't have that natural sponge soaking up when there's a major rain event. And it's going to be damaging all these other properties around. So we were able to do calculations on that. And then that's a great piece to read through. And then the last is actually the mental health impact. We always talk about money. We talk about people's physical health. But the mental health impact is when people got flooded out. When we went out and did a study in Burlington, Ontario, after a major flood in 2014, nearly 200 millimeters fell in just several hours in Burlington. 3,500 homes got flooded out. We reached out to people 3 years later, and people still have post-traumatic stress disorder. They have elevated levels of anxiety, even levels of depression. Since that, anytime it rains, they rush home from work. They call their kids to make sure their sub pump's working. All this stuff is part of the work we get to do, and we get to reach out to Canadians. And when you're reaching out to people, everybody has a story, and that's where we were able to really put that into that report to say mental health is a big aspect we're now all understanding as a larger piece, but it's associated with climate change, and we need to make sure that connection is there.
I actually,
Sorry, go ahead.
You kind of completely covered, like, in a very wholesome way, like, the different aspects of your job. And I really love that last slide about how you mentioned the mental health, because I think that's often something, like, even in today's society, we're bringing more awareness to it in all sectors, and how it can, like, really, like, by focusing on it more, we can, improve. And I really thought your way of tackling kind of the non-believers, or the non-converted, as you kind of mentioned earlier, and kind of helping them see, like, the way, like, kind of to, I suppose the best way to word it is that the people who are blocking your way, you kind of show them a different way of looking at it, instead of just trying to spit the facts of, like, oh, like, this percentage is in our atmosphere and this percentage will happen now. But it's like you're focusing on what's in their life and how it impacts them. So I feel like that's really cool. So one question that I have for you, which you did kind of touch upon, is that a lot of people, at the same time, they feel like it's too hard. Climate change is too big for individual actions, and it's kind of like impossible to reverse it. So how do you think that your personal and professional actions are affecting our environment on a bigger scale?
I mean, I guess I could touch on this slide too in just a second, but I think we all have to realize, whether how young you are, later on in your career, you can be in a totally different career, or end of your career. Everyone can have an impact. And I think the best way is just, there's so many volunteer groups out there that are doing work, whether it's, food nexus pieces that are out in large cities. How can you help with community gardens? How can you help reach out with groups who are, kind of stigmatized, or aren't always part of the conversation? One of the things I actually learned at a recent conference I went to, there was one of the chiefs, and pardon me, I forget from what First Nations group, but he said, the minute I see come out, and it's a stakeholder on there, and my group is a stakeholder. And he said, I throw it in the garbage, because we're not stakeholders. We're more than that. You have to include us right from the beginning, and we have to be fully immersed in what you're trying to do, so we can help you. Because if you say we're a stakeholder, we're the first one. We know a lot of the initiatives and different progresses that help us and have helped us through generations, and you need to make sure that's recognized. But when I'm talking at an individual level, joining a group, both for social good, and usually social good and environmental good go back and forth. And then when I'm talking about myself, I was part of the Green Volunteers in Toronto for a number of years. I volunteered a lot with different groups like that. And then just with my jobs, you kind of always make a point of trying to go a little bit above and beyond, and bring your idea of what you're interested in, and bring an idea of how that can be associated with your work. And I think that's always important. One of the great pieces that just came out recently was from Public Safety Canada. They put a call out for proposals to say, how can we include First Nations groups, women, new Canadians, and low-income individuals in the topics of climate change? Because usually these are groups that are generally forgotten about and not always included. So how do you include those groups and make sure they have a voice to be heard? Because everyone has an opinion, and everyone has a good point of view on this topic. For myself, this is some of the stuff I do as well to make an impact. I developed a course, an online training course for Insurance Brokers Association of Canada. There's 40,000 members across Canada. And one of the pieces that I felt was really great that I helped out with is, if you have a flood in your basement, one of the first people you call, if you're not calling 311, letting them know your basement's flooded in your local municipality, so you're calling your insurance broker saying, do I have coverage for this? Because I have a swimming pool in my basement that I didn't actually put in there by happen chance, and I want to know that it can be paid for. And brokers are the ones on the end of the line who are getting yelled at, and it's not their fault. They're trying to figure out when someone's at their lowest, or their most stressed out, their most anxiety-riddled kind of self, and they have to help them move forward with that. So I was able to develop this course at the center and work with them and say, this is what you need to know about climate change, this is what you need to know about flooding. And then we created free resources for them and share with their clients. So when you get an upset client, call you on the phone. It's like, hey, this is stuff you can do now. This is stuff you can do to be proactive if you're worried about flooding. And for themselves, they also were able to get accredited for it because they have to do continuing education every year, similar to lawyers or engineers. So this is what I like to do. It's something practical that can be done. They use it because it's beneficial for their career. But also I've gotten a lot of messages back saying, I've used this with clients. They love it. It's all free. We're not trying to charge put out on mass like this course. Makes me feel like I'm at least doing in this larger picture of what we can do to, adapt to climate change.
Awesome.
Going a little bit of depth in what else I do in my jobs. I sit on committees and tables and talk about climate adaptation resilience. This one here, actually the report was just released yesterday. It's the action plan report for the Great Lakes in 2030. And it's a call to the Canadian government to spend $2.8 billion, the federal government to spend $2.8 billion over the next 10 years on resiliency and adaptation measures around the Great Lakes Basin and St. Lawrence Basin. That seems like a lot of money, especially since what's going on with COVID-19 right now in our country. But the US has already ratified this. They've already committed through the next 10 years. So Canada should be following in their steps and should be doing something similar. So getting an opportunity to speak on things like this, learning from different experts, I love to do that kind of stuff. If you can network with people who are later on their careers, more experienced, you can learn from them and then talk about your experiences. That's always a great thing to do. And if your job allows that, even if you're nervous or you're not, fully comfortable with it yet, I always say just try and go for it. When it comes to career stuff like this, go for it and then kind of ask for forgiveness if you make a mistake afterwards. Because people understand, everyone's been in that situation that you are in right now for initiatives like this. And then, have your name on a report or feel like you've done something else, either for your country or international countries with how we're handling climate change. And then another large part of my job is just being a keynote speaker and doing presentations all across Canada. All these different pictures are very different pieces. The one on the top left was a presentation I gave to students at Seneca College and Fleming College. The one in the middle is the one I gave to the yearly conference for home inspectors. And again, home inspectors you might not think is a group that traditionally has been a part of the climate change or sustainability file, but if they're inspecting homes and you can highlight a little bit more about what you should be looking for about flood entryways, they get into it. And that's where I'm talking about some of these groups that you might say, oh, they don't maybe haven't been a part of the conversation beforehand. If you can relay information to them that's valuable to their career or valuable to themselves, they're going to jump on board. The one at the top right, that was out east in New Brunswick. I spoke at the Atlantic Brokers Conference there, talking about flooding and climate change. The one in the bottom left, that was me out in Squamish, BC, speaking to Red Cross volunteers about going door to door and notifying homeowners about how to prepare for the coming flooding season at the fire hall there. The one in the middle was Red Cross headquarters in London, Ontario. So I did something similar there. And the one at the bottom right, that was concerned residents up in Kawartha Lakes in Northern Ontario here, along the Burnt River, who've been flooded out every season. And they were looking for what are some next steps they can take to better prepare their property. So that's kind of a day in the life of me. I also do some media here. Unfortunately, this media appearance was thrust on me without much warning. So I wore my most ridiculous dress shirt. Didn't get to put a comb through my hair, but it worked out. So I get to do a lot of media pieces, whether it's on radio, whether it's through newspaper, or here, whether it's on TV or video. So that's a great piece to talk about my research and how it's relevant to the average Canadian. I guess this is kind of the ending piece for myself here about kind of how I got to this point in my career. The top, terrifying looking tree, and that person in the tree was me. So the middle picture is in a giant tree. I did forestry for 2 years, and that's my team in the bottom left as well. So I did forestry for two and a half years in York region and really worked on how to protect large swaths of. Me being in the tree, that's a kind of a nice gentle nod to always kind of just say yes to stuff. This happened to be, it was the kids' open day at York Region, and they wanted someone to be the mascot. I said, I don't know. But then they said, you get time and a half for it. So absolutely, I'll jump in a tree suit, and it's 40 degrees outside. I get time and a half, and I got to make some kids laugh, and well, some kids cry too, so that was a little devastating, but it was exciting. You know, you get to do these random little things, and it's just, you know, your career could take you kind of anywhere. And great, you know, you get to drive ATVs and trucks. You get to protect, you know, species and endangered species, and also make sure you're mitigating and taking out dog strangling vine, buckthorn, all these invasive species that are first land. So that. The very top, it says the final discharge. That's some of my research I did when I was at the Ontario Ministry of Vision there. So what it's essentially saying is, my master's thesis was called Drink Back to the Funeral Industry on Receiving Water Bodies, especially the embalming process. When a body's embalmed for a viewing for funeral, a lot of the times, a lot of those contaminants end up in our wastewater treatment plants. A wastewater treatment plants contaminants out, so we end up having embalming chemicals and carcinogenics end up in our receipt on that and got authored in it. So that kind of stuff really, really was enjoyable for me. And then bouncing back to the top right and the mid right, I worked at Lake Simcoe Region Conservation, also doing some forestry work, and that was looking at, you kind of see this heat map here, spots to actually increase our urban canopy. And what I mean by that is to increase the level of tree coverage in a given large city, and how that would actually benefit carbon sequestration, how it would limit flooding because you have more root systems, higher levels of infiltration, and also how you're reducing cooling costs in the summer, and you're also reducing pollutants in the atmosphere. So that was a really cool research. And that was my office at the time, just working. It was amazing.
That's pretty cool. Yeah, it's actually something you mentioned about removing invasive species. So I'm part of a group here in New York, and it's called STATE. So it's basically for students to take action. And which was probably the most painful extraction I've done, was these plants called mile a minute, and they grow and they're kind of like vines, and they overtake every like native plant in the area, and it's so hard to get all of it, and it takes like consistent work of maybe 5 to 10 years. How do you find opportunities and careers in sustainability, and what do you think will be interesting jobs kind of like in this field?
The question is really how careers are out there. In the middle, and quickly I already touched about me working at Seneca, so that's myself with one of my colleagues, Andrew Wickham, who's a professor there right now. But in the middle, that's a kind of a testing well, and what is there is permeable pavements or low impact to be in right now. Cities like Toronto we have our green roof bylaw. We have the largest green roof network because of this bylaw. Over a certain amount of square footage in a building, you're required to put a green roof on top. Also have a place where, depending the type of green roof you use, you can use as a community garden up top, but you can also help cool and maintain the level of ambient temperature within the building. That goes to bioswales in communities. That goes, so when it rains, you're not having that overland flow go to the level of a house, so it's impacting your neighbors. It sinks down into the ground that much quicker, and potentially if you have a cistern under there, kind of like an underground, reuse that as gray reuse water to water your plants later, use it for your garden, use it for your lawn. So if I were to suggest pieces to look into, low impact developments, if you have an engineering background, that's a great piece of it, especially if you have a mechanical or civil background, that's always really cool. When we're talking about water resources, hydrology, hydrogeology, if you have a background in that, anything regarding flooding, that is Canada's most devastating natural disaster. It has overtaken fire in terms of the highest insurable losses over 5 years ago. So that's a great piece. If you're into forestry like I was before, wildfires and heat stress pieces, heat islands, we had 82 people die in Montreal, 3 stress and heat island effect. There's a lot of stuff about how can you maintain wetlands, how can you maintain large swaths of green infrastructure, and let, whether it's urban planners or developers know this needs to be kept here because we need to make sure that you're reducing a heat island effect. As well, if you're really into social causes, there's a lot of tie-ins between being a social activist as environmentalist. Those always go hand in hand. And like I said before, the Canadian government put a call out for proposals saying there's a lot of groups who aren't always brought in to the planning processes. So you really, and if there's people who are community leaders, for First Nation groups, African American, new Canadian groups, what have you, it's great to have a leader like that say, I also want to bring the environmental aspect into this because it's going to impact historically unfairly over the last couple of decades. So we want to make sure our community brings that in. And we also want to be the big piece I've always felt when you go into community, you want to leave them with something. You don't want to go, okay, it's all yours, go figure it out. You want to train the trainer. You want to leave people in that community who can then take the knowledge you taught them and make sure they're teaching the next generations, other people who work there. There's a great piece actually that the Canadian Association of, it's Canadian Mortgage Housing Corporation, CMHC, pardon me, did out in Sydney, Nova Scotia. They went out and they taught people within the community how to retrofit and how to restore flooded homes with on the reserve. And when they did that, they went through a very intensive training protocol, and they had engineers there and everything else. But they didn't just say all this stuff and leave them tons and tons of documents. They actually trained 10 individuals who live in the community. So they were prepared. They planned, they proactively prepared all the houses in the community and worked like that. That's where I'm saying the social good and the activism pieces can work hand in hand. And really, as I said before, you work in anything, you work in finance, sustainable finance is huge now, environmental sustainability goals, ESGs, climate disclosures. If you're a person on Bay Street or Wall Street making hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars a year handling portfolios, you can also look at companies now which disclose saying, we also prepare and invest in renewables and sustainable solutions, and we're prepared for tornadoes, hurricanes, floods, fires. And actually that lets you know as an investor, I should be investing my client's money into that, because if there is an event, they're not going to suffer a major loss. So there's lots of things, anybody, any background you have, you can be on. If you have an interest in it, I would say take whatever job and then just start slowly steering yourself towards it. I would say that's kind of your best.
That was a really good, multifaceted and interdisciplinary answer. So that was great. We have a question from Emily from the audience. So she says, I love your approach on how people should not be ashamed of being unaware and your understanding of nature. As you have educating others about climate adaptation, can you give any advice on how to approach corporations about sustainability concerns and how to show them the significance of something that is not their priority?
Emily, that's a great question. First and foremost, I'm not going to sugarcoat it. It's very hard. But the best way to look at it as when you're talking about sustainability practices or initiatives or programs, or you're talking about climate adaptation pieces, is when you're talking about sustainability, you have to treat it like a language. So you can't go into an office that speaks all English and then start speaking Portuguese. They're not going to understand you. So the best way to go in there is for corporations like you're mentioning that don't have sustainability concerns. You could say, what great piece when we talk about the carbon tax. You could still be a polluter at a high level and churn out as much paper products as you needed to, but then you had to pay this higher tax or pay for smaller companies so you could still pollute and still be at that level of output that you needed to be. So that was nice. That was a really cool piece that, Ontario, we've done away with at this point, but I think BC's still doing it. But that's a piece where you could say, you can still have the same output, but now you're going to be penalized. And because you're being penalized, to create a new division in your company that should be focusing on how are you reducing your carbon output? How are you reducing your pollution output? Are you putting a new scrubber on your stacks to make sure that the amount of carbon going out, the amount of methane going out is less? Is there a way that your processes, or is there a way that your, your whole supply chain coming in can be reduced? Is there a way to turn some of your fleet, if you have a large amount of gasoline guzzling or diesel, chugging trucks, can you turn some of them into at least a hybrid vehicle, especially if you're just going out to meet with clients? And that's how you can talk to them. For myself, working with banks and then working with people like insurance companies, you go out and say, your bottom line is being affected by climate change. So for insurance groups, they're going, we're paying out claims that are going like this every single year. You have that exponential curve going up. The best way to go out about this is to teach all your employees to really say, hey, if you install something like this, and this is called a backwater valve, if you install something like this in your home to prevent a sewage backup, so you don't have water coming into your home, see that? That'll go up when there's a sewage backup coming into your home, so it prevents nasty sewage water from coming in your home. If you install that on your lateral, then you can get a discount on your insurance premium every single year. And if you reach out to your local municipality we've worked with, they'll actually help pay for that. They have flood subsidies in municipalities across Canada, and I know in the US as well. So depending where you're located, take a look at what your local community or municipal government is doing, because a lot of them offer literally free money to install things like a backwater valve or a sub pump or other things to protect yourself. So I guess the short and sweet of it is, if you're going to be talking to groups, you can't be saying solely that. The best way is to kind of trick them in a way. It's great. I worked with red-side dace, which is an endangered minnow species here. And they're in a lot of the water bodies, around large construction areas. And so the big piece there is you want to protect the species because it's a bioindicator to tell how healthy that larger water habitat is. But the other piece you can add to that is say, hey, you know what's really nice that you can have in this community? Everyone loves having park space. So make sure that the developer then understands, okay, we got to protect this wetland area and this stream area, and we can put walking paths in there. That will up the price of those houses. People will pay more to live in these developments I've built with my company. I'm going to make work, and that's fine. But you can talk to them about that. Have a thinly veiled kind of approach to say, we can save you money, we can protect your investment, and you can also have this intrinsic and instrumental value of protecting larger species. But if you go in there saying, we need to save a fish that's this big, a lot of people who are making millions of dollars every year, unfortunately, they might just not care. So there's a way to speak about it, and you have to speak their language. So that's, I guess, the best approach I can say in terms of prioritizing how you can talk to groups.
Okay, I have a few more questions for you, and then we're going to wrap up with our key takeaways. But I would say that you've had a pretty interesting path in your career. I think you've gone like in many different directions, and I think that's what gives you kind of like an edge in your current like position. So looking back, what do you think are the best decisions and actions that you've taken? And if you could give yourself advice like now to your former self 10 years ago, what would it be?
Yeah, just touching on the valuable actions is just say yes to stuff. It can be scary and it's hard, and I still say yes to stuff that I don't always feel comfortable doing. But you kind of just go in there and just try your best. The best example is that picture I pulled up when I was working at York Region in that stupid tree costume. I said yes over the weekend, and I met some actually high-level people, and they invited me back. They said, York Region said, we'll pay you longer. We want you to put on, this little event. We want you to stay on and help host a barbecue. So I said, sure. And I stayed longer, and I chatted with people who are, millionaires who have these amazing businesses. And I just chatted to them, like, how did you get to that point? And learning from people who were later on in their careers. And then I actually got to drive home a gentleman who's ended up writing like one of the top birding books in Canada and is like the top level expert on birds across this country. And I just ended up having him in my car and driving him home because he needed a ride. So just saying yes to even just extracurricular stuff like that outside your job. Maybe number one, you're not getting paid for it. Maybe, you feel like you don't have time, but if you can just say yes every once in a while, you'll be surprised where those opportunities take you. Even with this job for myself, partnering with the Intech Center while I was at Seneca, I said yes to partnering. And, I was talking to my boss, reach out to the group you're collaborating with now, and my boss now is Blair. He said, just reach out to him and see what he thinks of you potentially working there. I said, okay, yeah. And he's like, you can use this spot as a stepping stone. And I did, and that was the first job that I didn't have to send in an application for. He was just really impressed with my work and taking on this very intensive program of developing a course, and he hired me on the spot. And I think you just kind of have to get scared a little bit and just say yes every once in a while, and just go for stuff that are maybe outside your comfort zone. And if I could maybe look back at my, let's say my 16-year-old self, is just, if you're interested in something, go for it. And if you fall flat on your face, it's fine. Everyone gets up, and everyone's done that, and everyone's failed before. And, the failing is just part of the progress towards success. And you're going to fail a bunch of times, and your face is going to hurt, and it sucks. But there's going to be people around you who failed, and they see something in you that goes, yeah, I did that 20 years ago, and I remember failing, and it was hard. But you meet mentors that way who see something in you, and that's always really something you got to remember is, no matter how much you feel like you're a fish out of water, or you're not in your comfort zone, and you feel like maybe you're on a call or you're in a meeting, that just go to it. If you have an opinion, say it. And if people think it's stupid, doesn't matter. There's almost, there's coming up to 8 billion people on this planet. Someone's going to think the stuff you're interested in is cool and is worthwhile working on. So that would be my advice.
That's great. I really liked that. But something that I really liked about your presentation is that it's very actionable. Like, you definitely presented a lot of opportunities for all of us to kind of really think about, and different ways for us to get involved and kind of change how we're thinking now. So I think you presented a lot of these within your presentation, just call to actions. But what is one final call to action that you'd like to propose to the audience? What can we do now to help?
Yeah. I would say you're already doing it. You're on a call like this because you're interested in sustainability or adaptation or just climate change in general. You just piqued your interest. And that alone that's all of it. It's just educating yourself. And, whether it's educating what's going on currently in the world with COVID, or what's going on in the world with Black Lives Matter, there's so many things that we're constantly learning, and you have to be prepared to learn, and you have to also be prepared to be a novice and feel like you don't know what's going on. That's part of just growing up and learning. And this is a great call to action right here. Is you're on a webinar, you're trying to learn something new. You're probably either already working in this field or want to work in this field. And that's the first step, just educating yourself and just reaching out, because I can tell you, I've reached out to a bunch of different people, and you don't get emails back. When I was a younger student, and then maybe one out of those 15 emails, someone writes back and goes, hey, here's a report I worked on, and take a look at this. And that might turn into you getting back to them a week later and go, I really liked your report. I didn't understand everything about it. Could you tell me a little more? The minute you ask someone to tell something to you about what they're interested in, that's when you kind of open up those avenues. So I would say a call to action is just reach out to people who you think can help you out, because generally a lot of people like to talk about themselves and like to talk about stuff that makes them happy. And that could benefit you in the long run by letting you work in a field that makes you happy. So I would just say that's the call to action, is just be a little brave. We're all scared, be a little brave and reach out to people. That would be my call to action.
So from Veronica, how would you approach, this is kind of a situational example, but how would you approach a construction site that does not recycle at all, not even cardboard? How would you help them become more sustainable?
Sure. Number one is you just want to talk to someone who's in charge. So, with a construction site, obviously you can't enter it. You have to have hard hat. You have to steel-toed boots. They're not going to just let members of the public reach in. But, a lot of times they have the contact number of the foreman on site. And if she picks up the call, just say, hey, I noticed you guys, aren't doing really a lot of stuff with recycling, or there's a lot of waste materials I've seen there. And if you want to take that action upon yourself, go, hey, you know what? I'm an aspiring student in this environmental field. I have a few friends that would love to help you guys out, and I'd love to do the recycling for you, or get in touch with another company that could help us, do a little bit of this recycling for you. So always try and reach out to see who's in charge, because sometimes if you're just reaching out to a person who's at the front door, they're just going to turn you away. But if you could reach out to a group and just, especially someone who's, the project manager heading that operation, the foreman, and if you can reach out to them and say, hey, I've noticed this and I think I can help out. If you chastise people and say, you should do this, generally people aren't going to do it. That's just human nature. If you're going to look at human psychology, if you tell someone, hey, this needs to be done now, and it's done in a way that the onus is all on them to do something, they're going, I'm already tapped out. Some of those people might be on the site for 12 hours a day and they don't have time to even think about it. But if you can go, hey, I can offer you a service, especially for free, people are going to jump at that opportunity. So I would say, if you can lend yourself to help somebody out and not blame them, but say, hey, I think I know how I can make sure that this could, benefit you guys. And also for them, it lets them go back to either their boss, their board of directors, and say, hey, we collaborated with someone who came up to our site, and now we're 100% recyclable on all our recyclable materials. So pieces like that, if you can lend yourself and offer a service, especially for free to someone, instead of going, you need to do this, you're going to have a better success rate.
Awesome. Okay. So our key takeaways are that flooding and heat risk are among the most imminent environmental risks in Canada as a result of climate change, and that social impact activism and climate change go hand in hand. We work together with them to represent the underrepresented groups in Canada and also around the world in sustainability and climate change. And financial groups and investment groups are investing in climate resilience, and their impact is going to be very important in the next 10 years or so. So as a final kind of closing for everyone, I think Daniel already mentioned it, but knowledge is power, and that knowledge is great, but we just need to make it actionable. Go out, don't be scared, and everyone will do great.